I am Brianna, 27 years old, and the night my mother laughed in my face, I finally understood that no amount of hard work would ever make me a daughter in her eyes. We were at dinner in Austin, gushing over my twin Madison's royal wedding as my parents spoke of imported flowers and a private garden venue, and a honeymoon so expensive it made no sense for a family that had always told me to be practical. I let them talk until I asked the one question that should never have caused a room to go silent. I asked about my $1,500,000 share of the inheritance fund. My mother just leaned back, smiled as if she were explaining something obvious to a child, and said, "Gold and dirt are not the same." Madison actually clapped at that. I didn't cry, I didn't argue, I just took my keys and I walked out. Have you ever been the responsible one in your family only to realize they were just using your competence to fund their own chaos? Drop a comment with the word pillar. If you've lived through this, I want to hear your story. The cold Austin night air felt sharp against my skin as I sat in the dark interior of my car, the silent shadow of my parents' estate looming in the rearview mirror. I didn't start the engine immediately. I didn't drive home to sob over the insult my mother had just thrown at me. Sadness is a luxury for those who can afford to be unproductive, and after 27 years of being the invisible pillar of this family, I knew exactly what my labor was worth. I opened my laptop, and the screen's blue light cut through the darkness of the cabin. To my family, I was just the boring forensic accountant who handled their little paperwork issues. They never bothered to ask how I became a lead auditor so young. They ignored the fact that I had cleared my CPA exam at 21 and spent the next 6 years working 80-hour weeks to build a reputation that was now more valuable than their entire estate. But to the professional world in Austin, I was the one who determined who was solvent and who was a risk. In their rush to build a $1,500,000 wedding for Madison, my family had made a fatal error. They had built their house of cards on the foundation of my professional reputation. They didn't realize that my professional vouching wasn't a choice I made freely. Months ago, Charles had slipped those personal guarantee clauses into a thick stack of routine corporate audits, banking on my exhaustion and trust to fund Madison's vanity. He didn't just ask for my help, he engineered a trap. My mother and sister assumed I was a utility they could overdraft indefinitely, without consequence. They didn't realize that their royal event was currently floating on professional sponsorships and credit guarantees that I had personally vouched for. My word was the only reason the vendors hadn't demanded full, upfront payments months ago. I pulled up my Gilded Ledger, the encrypted file, where I kept track of every professional favor I had ever extended to the business known as the Gilded Legacy. My fingers moved with the cold, sharp precision of an auditor. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was just balancing the books. The first email went to the representative at the Austin estate venue. They were holding a primary weekend for Madison, based on a temporary professional hold I had requested through my corporate network. I typed a brief, formal note withdrawing my sponsorship and clarifying that I would not be financially responsible for any outstanding balances. I didn't ask them to cancel the wedding. I just removed the safety net. Next, I targeted the referral codes. The high-end floral designer had granted my mother a 15% discount, saving her tens of thousands of dollars solely because I was a recurring client for my firm's corporate galas. I logged into the portal, and I revoked the authorization. Then, I contacted the luxury transportation vendor. I had vouched for my family's creditworthiness to secure a delayed payment schedule. I informed them that my professional guarantee was now void. I watched the clock on my dashboard. It was exactly 12:03 a.m. In less than 15 minutes, I had systematically dismantled the professional infrastructure, keeping their social facade alive. Without my name anchoring those contracts, the vendors would be forced to follow standard risk protocols. They would demand full payment of the $1,500,000 immediately, or they would walk. Gold and dirt. Those 3 words from my mother didn't just sting. They performed a full forensic audit on my entire history with this family. While Madison was off performing the role of the perfect socialite, I was the one quietly acting as the structural integrity of their lives. I remember when I was only 19 years old and the Gilded Legacy was on the brink of a catastrophic collapse. My parents had mismanaged 3 major real estate acquisitions in a row, and their creditors were closing in. While Madison was at an elite social gala in Dallas, I spent 72 hours straight, locked in my father's office, auditing their books and restructuring their debt to keep them from losing everything. I saved the family empire, and in return, my mother looked at my exhausted face and asked why I couldn't be more charming like my twin. This was the trap of normalized cruelty that had defined my existence. To Angela and Charles, my skills and my labor were never recognized as a sacrifice or a gift. They were viewed as a free, natural resource. They looked at my intellect and my work ethic the same way an oil tycoon looks at a gusher, something to be tapped and drained until the well runs dry. They didn't feel the need to offer warmth or gratitude because, in their minds, my labor was simply a utility that came with the house. By calling me dirt, my mother wasn't just insulting me. She was attempting to justify her own parasitic behavior by declaring the source of her wealth to be beneath her. Then, there was the wedding fund itself. My grandparents had intended it to be an equal legacy for both of us, but I was the only one who treated it as a sacred trust. Over the past decade, I have personally contributed $25,000 to that account. Every dollar represented hours of overtime, missed vacations, and the kind of discipline saving Madison has never understood. I thought I was building a foundation for my own future with Jackson. Instead, I discovered that my family had forged a narrative where my contribution was just another family donation they were entitled to spend on Madison's $1,500,000 spectacle. I realized then that I was bound by the invisible chains of the survivor. When you are raised in a house where you are only as good as your last professional favor, you learn to live in a prison without bars. My silence for all those years wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a survival strategy. I was trapped in the belief that if I stayed useful enough, I could eventually balance the ledger of their affection. But that was the ultimate accounting error. You cannot pay off a debt of love with a currency of competence. Standing at that table, I finally saw the truth. The ledger of my life was perpetually out of balance because I was the only one paying into it. The silence that followed my exit wasn't an admission of guilt from my family. It was a tactical pause before the siege. Madison didn't wait 24 hours to begin her performance. By the next evening, she had already launched a carefully curated smear campaign on social media, posting vague, tearful quotes about family loyalty and the unfathomable bitterness of those who can't stand to see others succeed. Angela was right there in the comments, playing the role of the heartbroken mother who had given everything only to be betrayed by a selfish child. They weren't just attacking me, they were trying to rewrite my 27 years of invisible service as a history of envy. The messages from Charles were different. They weren't emotional, they were threats disguised as business directives. He sent a single, cold text stating that my erratic behavior had endangered the family's standing with the Legacy Social Club. He warned me that if I didn't immediately reinstate the professional sponsorships and referral codes I had withdrawn, my membership would be permanently revoked. He even suggested that my firm might hear about my unprofessional conduct regarding a family contract. They truly believed that threatening my social standing and my career would force me back into my role as their silent, unpaid auditor. I looked at the screen of my phone and realized they weren't shocked by what they had done. They were simply shocked that I had stopped playing along. For my entire life, I had been the one to fix their mistakes and balance their books, all while they told me I was dirt. Seeing them align against me so seamlessly was the final push I needed to shed the last bit of pity I had been carrying. I realized that I wasn't fighting a family. I was auditing a predatory investment firm that happened to share my last name. I didn't reply to Madison's posts or Angela's dramatic voicemails. Instead, I called Caleb, a legal partner known for his lethal precision in forensic investigations. I met him in his office, which always smelled of expensive espresso and the ink of consequences. I handed him the Gilded Ledger and my authorization to begin a formal, high-stakes audit of the wedding fund and the primary investment accounts of the Gilded Legacy. I told him I wanted every dollar accounted for, from the $1,500,000 wedding budget down to the personal contributions I had made over the last decade. I knew that my father's gilded empire was built on a foundation of appearance, and I was the only one who knew where the structural cracks were hidden. As Caleb began reviewing the initial filings, the air in the room changed. We were no longer discussing family drama. We were initiating a systematic strike against a corrupt estate. I wasn't looking for a seat at their table anymore. I was preparing to repossess the table itself. Caleb sat in his high-backed leather chair, the glow of 3 monitors reflecting in his glasses. The room was silent, except for the rhythmic clicking of his mouse. He had been digging through the digital archives of the Gilded Legacy for hours, searching for the path the $1,500,000 had taken after it left my grandparents' trust. Finally, he paused. He didn't look at me with his usual professional detachment. He looked at me with something that resembled pity, which is a rare emotion for a man who spends his life dissecting the worst of humanity's greed. "Brianna," he said, his voice low and resonant in the quiet office, "I found it. I found the reason they were so confident you would never walk away. Your father didn't just spend the inheritance. He didn't just empty the wedding fund. He turned your entire professional existence into his personal insurance policy. He didn't do it alone. He conspired with a corrupt loan officer at the equity firm, an old college friend who bypassed the standard verification protocols. They accepted my forged seal as gospel, intentionally skipping the confirmation calls just to push the $1,500,000 through for Charles's failing empire." He swiped a digital file onto the central screen. It was a formal loan guarantee for a $1,500,000 high-risk line of credit issued to my mother's firm Angela's Legacy Real Estate. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the technical language of the contract. It was a predatory loan, the kind used by desperate companies to stay afloat when their cash flow has dried up and traditional banks won't touch them. But it was the final page that made the room tilt. There, in the section reserved for the certifying forensic accountant, was my name. Below it sat a perfect digital replica of my professional CPA seal, the stamp I used for my highest level corporate audits. I stared at the signature. It was a near-perfect imitation of my professional scrawl. It was a stranger's handwriting, wearing my name like a mask. My father, the man who had sat at the head of the table 2 nights ago and called me a worthless burden, had forged my signature to guarantee the very debt used to fund Madison's lifestyle. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. He had made me the legal guarantor for their social facade. If their real estate investments had slipped even a fraction of a percent, the bank wouldn't have just come for the family estate. They would have come for me. They would have stripped me of my license, liquidated my personal savings, and destroyed my career just to pay for my sister's imported flowers and designer gowns. I was the illegal collateral for the sister who called me dirt. They had used me as a human shield against their own financial incompetence. The irony was lethal. They needed me to stay small and silent in public, so they could privately exploit my integrity to keep their world from burning down. They hadn't just stolen my money. They had attempted to steal my future. I looked at the forged document, and for the first time, I didn't feel the phantom weight of family obligation. The invisible chains finally snapped. This wasn't a family disagreement. This was a felony. My father hadn't just crossed a line. He had committed a crime, using my identity as the weapon. My compassion had been a resource they had overdrawn for the last time. The ledger was finally clear. I looked at Caleb, my expression turning to stone. "We're not just auditing them anymore," I said. "We're initiating a total liquidation. It's time to show them exactly what happens when the foundation they've been stepping on decides it's done carrying the house." The venue for the Legacy Social Club's annual gala was a masterclass in artificial perfection. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen tears over a room filled with Austin's most influential figures, all sipping vintage champagne and discussing the unfortunate rumors surrounding the Carter family estate. I stood at the entrance, invisible in a simple, perfectly tailored suit, watching the structural collapse of my family's social facade. The chaos had already begun. Earlier in the evening, the high-end catering team and the floral designers had realized the professional guarantees I'd withdrawn were gone. Standard risk protocols had kicked in, and the vendors had started demanding immediate payment for the $1,500,000 wedding balance. Behind the buffet tables, I could see the venue manager speaking in hushed, urgent tones to my father. Charles looked diminished, his face a blotchy shade of red, as his corporate credit cards were declined one after another. Angela and Madison spotted me near the bar and descended like vultures who had finally found a stabilizer. They didn't lead with insults this time. Instead, they tried to pivot to the family first narrative they had ignored for 27 years. Angela reached for my arm, her eyes wide with a performative desperation. Brianna, thank God you're here. There's been a massive misunderstanding with the accounts. You need to call the bank and fix this before the news reaches the board. We were wrong to be so harsh the other night, but we're a family. We can work this out. Madison stood beside her, her socialite mask cracked. Do something, Brianna. The florist is threatening to pull the arrangements for the wedding tomorrow. You can't let this happen. I didn't pull away. I didn't need to. I just looked at them with the cold, sharp precision of an auditor reviewing a bankrupt estate. I'm not here to fix your ledger, Angela, I said, my voice carrying a lethal, clinical calm. I'm here to deliver the final balance. I reached into my bag and pulled out a single, heavy manila folder. I didn't hand it to them. I laid it on the high-top table between us. You called me dirt while you were using my professional identity as a legal collateral. You thought I was a utility. You could overdraft forever. Charles joined them, looking like a man who had finally seen the bill for a debt he could no longer ignore. Whatever you're doing, stop it now. We can discuss the inheritance fund later. There is no later, I replied. 3 years ago, I realized that the Gilded Legacy was a name built on my silence and your absolute negligence. You were so focused on Madison's lifestyle that you forgot to pay the state's franchise taxes, letting Gilded Legacy Incorporated be administratively dissolved. I simply let it die, and then I registered the trademark and the name under my own LLC. I swiped a document from the folder, a certified trademark registration. You're not the CEO of a legacy, Charles. You're just a man using my brand without a license. Every real estate listing, every business card, and every social club membership currently using that name is in direct violation of my personal ownership. I saw Charles glance toward the bar where the family's lead counsel usually sat, but the seat was empty. Your lawyers received the full audit 4 hours ago, Dad, I said, my voice steady. They've already advised the board to distance themselves from you. That's why none of them are answering your calls. I handed Charles a formal cease and desist order. Effective immediately, you no longer have the right to use your own company name. Your brand is gone. Your social standing is void. I'm not just the dirt you stepped on. I'm the person who owns the ground you're standing on. And don't look at the door for help, I added, as the sound of heavy footsteps echoed in the foyer. I didn't just call the police tonight. I handed the complete forensic file to the district attorney last week. The officers in the lobby aren't here for the party. They're here to serve the federal warrants I spent 48 hours helping them draft. Madison gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Angela looked like she was finally realizing that their power had been rented and the lease had just expired. The surrounding tables, once filled with eager business partners, were suddenly vacant. I watched the lead investors, the men my father had spent months courting, quietly set down their glasses and signal their assistants to leave. In the high-stakes world of Austin real estate, social suicide is contagious, and no one wanted to be caught in the blast zone. I didn't wait for them to cry or beg. I simply turned and walked toward the exit. I didn't need to scream. The silence of their disappearing status was the loudest sound in the room. The audit of our lives concluded with the cold, hard finality of a federal indictment. Charles, the man who prided himself on being the ultimate strategist of the Austin elite, found himself facing 3 counts of criminal forgery and extensive investigations into charity fraud. It turns out that when you use your daughter's professional forensic credentials as illegal collateral for a high-risk loan, the interest comes due in a jail cell. The legal system did not care about his country club memberships or his gilded reputation. It only cared about the signature he had forged in his own hand. My mother's real estate empire, stripped of its trademarked name and the invisible structural support I had provided for a decade, collapsed with terrifying speed. Without the name The Gilded Legacy to hide behind, and without my ability to restructure her failing debt, Angela was forced to liquidate her remaining listings just to pay the restitution for the $48,000 she had fraudulently obtained from the church. The neighbors who had once clamored for an invitation to her table now crossed the street to avoid her gaze. Her power had been an illusion, a beautiful facade built on the labor of the daughter she called dirt. Madison's $1,500,000 wedding was reduced to a hollow performance. Without my professional guarantees to anchor the contracts, the vendors followed their standard risk protocols. They refused to move a single flower or pour a single drop of champagne until the full balance was paid in cash. The royal event ended as a bitter, public argument between my parents and the venue manager in an empty garden. Madison did not get her fairy tale. She got a front row seat to the reality that a life built on appearances cannot survive a lack of substance. A few months later, I stood beside a quiet, sun-drenched lake in Austin. Jackson took my hand under the shade of old trees that did not need a designer to look beautiful. My dress cost a fraction of Madison's, but it felt 1,000 times heavier with meaning because it was paid for by a woman who finally knew her own worth. There was no spectacle, no social media branding, and no one was there to be impressed. It was just a small group of people who had actually shown up for us in real life. I was not the invisible pillar of someone else's empire anymore. I was the architect of my own peace. I have come to realize that extreme favoritism is a slow-acting poison that hollows out every person it touches. It damages the child who is neglected by forcing them to earn basic dignity through labor, but it harrows the child who is worshipped even more. It teaches them that love can be replaced by indulgence, and that value comes from display instead of character. Eventually, those children wake up surrounded by the wreckage of choices they never had to justify. If you find yourself in a similar situation, being the responsible one who carries the weight of a family that treats you like an afterthought, remember that status is rented, but character is owned. My family's power was an illusion, maintained by my silent sacrifice. The moment I stopped being their stabilizer, their world folded, because there was nothing real underneath the gold plating. Forgiveness is not always for the other person. Sometimes it is the only way to set yourself free from a ledger that will never be balanced. Protecting your boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-respect. Stop being the bridge people burn while they are standing on it. You deserve a foundation that is honest, intimate, and built on mutual respect. If this story reminded you that your value is inherent and not a tool for toxic people, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to like and subscribe to support more accounts of justice and self-respect being served. Thank you for being a part of our community.